Hello everyone and welcome to Seeing Gaming from Different Angles, Differing Experiences of Gaming Without Sight. I am Sightless Combat and I am joined by three amazing panelists who are going to offer their own insights into the world of what some may term as blind gaming, though we will come on to that as a part of discussions later. Now, as I said, I'm going to just start with introductions. So I am Sightless Combat. I'm an accessibility consultant and gamer without sight. When I say that, I mean I have absolutely no sight whatsoever. You've probably heard me give presentations at previous GA Confs as well. I did a presentation on audio description relatively recently, which was very well received from what I remember. And I do YouTube videos, streaming, and write reviews, amongst other things, as well as working with studios to help improve the accessibility of their own projects, current and future. Now I will pass over to the next panelist. There is no specific order for these, so I will let them introduce themselves.
I'll go ahead and go first. So my name is Ross Miner, and I'm also completely blind. Surprise, surprise. Let's see. I am a YouTuber. I stream on Twitch, but my main job is mainly a Paralympic swimmer. I train at the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center in Colorado. Pretty much do that full time, and then I do YouTube videos of like technology and how I do this blind and how I play this video game blind, all sorts of stuff like that. And yeah, it's pretty much about me.
So who wants to go next?
All right. I'm Mike Fair, and I created the Odyssey magazine back in 1996. It covered games accessible to the blind, and I've seen it go from just text-based games through to audio games. And the magazine stopped in around 2004, and back then we hadn't really seen any activity on consoles, but that's certainly changed since. So I'm kind of an old school gamer. I tend to I like audio games. I have a PC and I game on my iPhone, so iOS, and those platforms have proved wonderful over the years. And I'm a little hesitant to get into the console space. It just seems like a lot of extra dollars for a questionable amount of games. So I'm more, I guess, an old school. I want everything in audio, and I don't want to lose out on any information.
And we will come on to that later. We will come on to that part of the discussion later, definitely, Mike. And we have our final panelist who will give an introduction before we start going into those topics a little deeper.
Hi, I am Lucy Greco. I am an accessibility evangelist. I work on web accessibility primarily, but my portfolio includes everything from devices, websites, applications, environments, anything about getting people with disabilities into technology or using their built environment. That's pretty much what I cover. So I am totally blind myself as well. I have been gaming since I was a wee child, on the old text adventures to audio games to console games. I've always wanted to play games. And for me, games were always a means of socialization. So I had my computer taken away in high school because we were caught using my computer to play games over the lunch hour.
Wow, that's that's definitely an interesting story to start off with. And I realized that I'd neglected to provide my own introduction to why I play video games and what systems I play on as well, which will feed well into our first topic of discussion, into our first main topic. So I primarily play console games. My console of choice really is the Xbox One, but specifically the Xbox One X at the moment. But I do plan to upgrade with all the next gen hardware on the horizon. But I do also play PlayStation 4 games. and we'll come on to that. The most recent one that I've played a large amount of course, being The Last of Us 2, which we're not going to cover in a great amount of detail, given that will already be a topic of discussion. But I also play PC games when I can, when and where I can, with accessibility or otherwise. But audio games as well. I've played a few over the years, but primarily my experience is with the accessibility of console games and PC titles in the mainstream side of things. And as to why, it's because I want to get involved with other people, so I want to engage on the same level as my sighted peers, and I want to have a great time with these immersive experiences that everybody's talking about, whether that's single player or multiplayer, local or online, regardless. So as for that, we've all discussed who we are and our sort of roots in gaming to an extent, at least. But we will now move into the preferred platform side of things as well. So I know Mike's already put his proverbial cards on the table, and as have I. But I will allow Lucy and Ross to do the same.
So I'll
yeah,
start here on this
ladies
one.
first. Ladies first.
Thank you, Ross. I don't actually have a preferred gaming platform, because for me, the accessibility is key. So if I find a game on one platform versus another that actually is accessible, that's the one I'm going to play. Recently I found a really good game that's actually accessible on both Android and iOS, which is really unusual that both platforms has equal accessibility. And so I played it on both, just because that's what you do, is you play on both. I play on PC a lot. I play on console when I can get my hands on a console. I don't own one, but I'm a little bit like Mike in that I'm not willing to make the investment for a few games, but if there were more games, I would probably be buying the console that had the most accessible games.
Makes a lot of sense. Actually, Lucy, which game was that you were referring to that's accessible on both Android and iOS? Just want to make sure.
It's called Untold, so it's an RPG.
Yes, Untold RPG, yes.
I was hesitant to pay the money, but then I realized, wait a minute, you've already spent 4 hours playing this, so I spent my money, and I'm only about another hour into the additional 8 hours of entertainment.
I think the cool thing is that personally, I've never heard of this game. Just absolutely never heard of it, and I think that's interesting because I usually don't touch many mobile games, and that kind of just highlights my preferences, I suppose. Because growing up, before I went blind, I played a lot of Nintendo 64 and PS2, GameCube, that era. After I went blind, I really didn't pick up Xbox or PC until I was in high school. I mainly just played on my DS as a gamer. But really, when I picked up Xbox and PC was really when my gaming kind of took off. I built my own computer. I have like 2 Xboxes, and those are the systems I prefer to play on. But kind of what you said, Lucy, I'm totally on board with. I completely agree. Like, if a game is accessible, no matter what console it's on, I'm pretty much gonna buy it. At least at this point where we are with accessibility, because that's pretty much what I do with the PS4. Or I feel like that's what a lot of blind people did, was they bought PS4 for Last of Us 2. But like even in the past, I mainly had a DS, Game Boy for Pokemon. So the whole playable/accessibility or playable/accessible games and buying a console for them, yeah, like that's pretty much what I did growing up, was why I had so many consoles.
I mean, you're not the only one who's done that as well. There are
For sure.
that goes back actually a few years to the start of the PlayStation versus Xbox, sort of what might loosely be termed as an accessibility arms race a few years ago in 2015, when we had the PlayStation 4 announced that it was there was a beta that had features in it had a version of text to speech for menus in it, and then Microsoft a few months later said, with our operating system, we're going to have, all of these accessibility features available, including narration, well, via narrator, as the name suggests.
Yeah.
And then there were lots of people who bought a PlayStation 4 and then realized it was region locked to the US, which is a very interesting turn of events. Hopefully the next generation consoles resolve that, but we'll come to that. We'll cross that proverbial bridge when we come to it. But in terms of that, that's where that trend really kicked off, I'd argue. But you're not the only one to do it. I know one gamer in particular who I essentially had a big, long discussion with, and they then ended up buying a PS4 and got the Last of Us 2 limited edition one because the game was that good. So developers, if you want to sell consoles, if you want to sell games, make them accessible and people will buy them. But, that brings us smoothly, really, onto our next point. Oh, yes, Lucy?
Just one last comment on that area, in that, it's been proven that people with disabilities tend to spend more time and more money on these things.
Accessibility sells.
It does.
Yes.
It really does. I mean,
yes, brand loyalty is what I was going to term it as. There's
exactly.
There's lots of people I've said, Microsoft have done a fantastic job with accessibility. Other companies are following suit, and they'll ask me what games I'd recommend. And once I recommend those games, I've had people go out and then ask me later, they've bought these games and they're like, how do I get started? Where do I get involved with all the community aspects? So with Killer Instinct, with Gears of War 4, Gears 5, and even sort of projects that aren't designed for the game to be overtly accessible but allow for an accessible experience. So things like Halo 5 Medusa, which is a map and mode set that I helped create or had assistance with creating through a number of cited co-forgers and playtesters. Even things like that, I've had people say to me, oh, can I possibly play this with you? And I'm like, we can probably set that up. So it's not just the standard accessibility features that people will look at. They will look at ways to enjoy the game in their own unique fashions, I think is a reasonable way of putting it. But that then does bring us rather smoothly into the benefits of accessibility, as to why accessibility is so important. So we've already had the idea that accessibility sells. That's kind of a key thing. If a game publishes accessibility features really early, like the various Ubisoft titles have started doing, like Microsoft titles have done, like I think it was Shadow of the Tomb Raider a couple of years ago. They published their things their information 4 weeks before launch, and that got a massive amount of hype generated for it. But there's also, of course, the thing that I alluded to in terms of community engagement and being able to socialize. I wonder if any of the other panelists have input on that, or things that haven't been covered, or maybe want to expand on those points as well.
Go ahead, Mike.
Certainly, I'm really after a fun experience. That's priority number one, and it has to be where I'm not feeling I'm missing out on anything. So, for example, if I know that a game like 6 Ages, Ride Like the Wind, that is a single-player game on iOS, but it is one of the most accessible with voiceover and one of the richest story-driven experiences I've ever had. It's a sort of a choose your own adventure meets a strategy sim. It's completely done turn-based, so there's no time pressure. You can take your time. You get lots of information, and I'm not feeling like I'm at all playing unequally with the sighted people who the game was originally designed for. So that if I know that a game has been made that accessible, I'll play it. And we've seen that also with things like Solera, which was unfortunately it's no longer around, but it lasted a long time. And part of the reason for that was that blind people were spending a lot on the extras that the DLC, the content that you pay for in terms of perks, in terms of extra advantages that you had to buy with real money. People stuck with that a lot longer because the game was completely accessible.
I had to stop playing a game one year because I spent over $1,000 in a year in in-game extras.
I,
Oh my gosh.
wow. I'm only unmuting my mic just to say, wow.
And I realized that was a little obsessive, so I stopped. So, I mean, other reasons I play is a social thing to me. I mean, there's, living in the Bay Area, people here are far apart from each other. I mean, I have friends all over the Bay Area. Nobody wants to travel 2 hours to visit somebody and then 2 hours to go home for an evening. So it's a good way to socialize in the evenings. And every single game I've found myself playing addictively like that has a social aspect to it. You're part of a team, a guild, an alliance, something along those lines is part of the game. And so I'm meeting these people virtually, and maybe they don't know who I really am. Maybe they just know my in-game personality, but it's a way to meet new people and interact with them. It's really quite cool. I mean, some of the people I interact with in these games are people I'd probably, if they were living next door to me, never interact with, but because we're very similar to each other, I'm interacting with these people and getting to know more about these people than I would ever have otherwise been.
That's
That's a great point. I was going to just make a very brief comparison to Sea of Thieves. It's a game that I've put numerous hours into, more so now that I'm actually playing it with a regular crew as part of my work as an Xbox Ambassador's Play host as well. So I'm streaming Sea of Thieves on their channel on Twitch, as well as on my own personal channel where I stream other content as well. But Sea of Thieves is a game where you crew up with other players and you can do pretty much whatever you want in a sort of pirate sandbox, piratical themed sandbox. And I've played with so many different players where I started introducing myself and saying, I'm a pirate with an eye patch over both eyes. And they're like, huh? Are you trolling? And they realized I wasn't. And that got a good number of conversations started. I think, Lucy, just one quick question before Ross chimes in. Which game did you spend $1,000 on? I think we're all slightly curious.
I'm a little ashamed. I've spent over, it actually in the end when we did the math was $1,700 in about 15 months on Travian.
I've never heard of the game, but
It's
even
a role-playing. It's a role-playing game, or not a turn-based real-time strategy game.
Ah, interesting. So yeah, Ross, you had a point you wanted to raise there. Sorry, I
yeah. I was just going to talk about essentially, why I play video games, why accessibility matters to me. Just because I probably should have mentioned this in the intro, to be honest, but I haven't always been blind. I was blinded from a gunshot when I was 8. And so essentially before that, before I went blind, I was used to being able to play all these video games. And then afterward, I wasn't able to do any of that. But that's kind of what my whole life was based around at the time. And so essentially after I went blind, I wasn't willing to let go of that social aspect. And that's why I play video games as well, as the social aspect, is because back when I was in 3rd grade when I went back to school after I went blind, and I didn't know how to socialize with all the people there because they were in their side of the world. I was in my blind world, and I was a kid and it was hard to find things to relate about. But video games and Pokemon as a kid was a way for me to socialize and make friends. If I didn't have that, my life would actually be much, much different. Yeah, I think video games are hugely beneficial when you're blind, just whether it's socialization or learning areas in your head, all that in the name of accessibility is why I've stuck with video games throughout my entire childhood, and it's why I'm still playing video games.
See, I guess that's a bit of a difference with my experiences. I've really gone after more of the single player games, and that has led to socialization on lists and of course on the Odyssey magazine that I started about approaching these different experiences and what we wanted. And there is that desperation. There's a real hunger. We want
Yeah.
to play the same things that everyone else wants to play.
Precisely.
And it's painful when something seems like it should be accessible and would give us the chance to really socialize, but unfortunately it's not made accessible to
Yeah.
blind people. I've run into that frequently, and that's super annoying.
Honestly, yeah, like the word you use, the hunger, like I feel like so many blind people probably understand just what that one word really conveys, because it's it's like we're all starving for accessibility. We're starving for a chance to play with our sighted counterparts and all that. Um, any blind person or even person with disability, I feel like will understand that. Yeah, the hunger for it.
I mean, exactly. I mean, that your story and your reasoning goes exactly back to why I got my computer taken away, because I snuck other kids into the resource center.
Exactly.
Computer. I mean, I wanted these kids to like me, and because I had access to video games and they didn't, you know, I was going to break the.
You were giving those people a, for lack of a better word, well, actually, a freedom, really.
Mhm.
You were giving those people a glimpse of sort of a new avenue, a new outlet,
Perspective.
essentially.
Yeah.
Perspective. Yes,
experience.
that's the word,
I
Ross.
mean,
That's the word I was looking for.
These were sighted students. So, I mean, they already had access to the video games, but it was more me being one of them. You know, they were all playing video games already at home, but the fact that, you know, I was able to play video games with them didn't make me that blind kid off on the corner
Yes.
doing their own blind kid thing.
Yeah, Lucy, I 1000% get where you're coming from. Like a specific example, like just right off the top of my head, I remember playing the audio game Swamp for some kids in English class in high school, showing them, hey, look, like blind people, like this is a game made completely out of audio. Like, what's different if you added video? Like that was my way of showing them, look, I'm just like you guys. Like I can play video games like you to some extent.
Yeah.
So I totally get that.
I was going to say,
I had the
Ross,
experience of.
oh.
I had the experience of it, having a Eureka A4, which is a computer for the blind with an Aussie accent and a Braille keyboard and no screen. I had that in the cafeteria in my high school, and I had sighted people playing a text game, one of the Zork games, along with me, and arguing about what to do next. And I remember feeling, wow, this is awesome. Like for one period, like it was we had it over a course of like maybe a 4 or 5 week period of lunch hours where we were trying to solve this game. And it was like, wow, you know, these things can really, you know, even if it's a single player game, it can really knock down bridges. Games are important, and we should have much more access to them than we currently do.
Absolutely.
I completely agree. And that leads well into the next point, which I would pose as a question, and it is a question, but I'm just going to throw it straight in. No real introduction needed. Audio games, benefit or barrier? There we go.
Benefit, absolute benefit. You know, it's again, what do you want with games? For me, as someone looking for fun experiences, that's my first bottom line, and I can get that best if information is auditorily presented. And if I will play games for sighted people, but I need to know that I'm not missing anything beyond eye candy. If I'm missing a little of the atmospheric stuff, I'm fine with that. But I need to be able to make decisions based on the same information as everybody else, and with the same degree of competence and speed, or at least something approximating that. Like that's kind of where I'm coming from. So for me, audio games have let me experience a lot that otherwise I could not have. Like for example, the race with Top Speed, when that came out, that was huge. I mean, that was the first time I would drive a racing game and really understand the stresses involved in driving, period. Like that's the first exposure I really had to that in a multi-car environment where you had other blind people racing. And I remember the impact that had on me and the understanding that gave me is, okay, why are people getting so stressed out, in real life driving situations? And this gave me a bit of insight into that. So yeah, from the experiential point, I would say yes, audio games have offered me a lot of insights that I could not have gotten otherwise. Now, unfortunately, it's harder to get sighted people to play audio games because they need eye candy, or
It's
they
not so
tend to
much
get
that
bored.
they need it, but they rely on it. There's a difference.
Yes.
I've had
Yeah.
so many people. Well, no, they seemingly rely on it. I've had so many people say to me, I've had various comments over the years. I had one person when I was discussing the accessibility of Killer Instinct a few years ago while the game was still in active development. I had a person say, I work with blind people. They don't play video games. It's not the done thing. and that amazed me first of all. But then when sighted players started to sort of, when they got their heads around the idea and sort of read the options I was suggesting for implementation at that point, so things like what eventually became the HUD meter volume slider, which allows you to hear the combo gauge essentially to get an idea of how close you are to losing, to sort of dropping your combo and not being able to cash out all that damage you've just done, for instance. Once sighted players got into that, they've really rallied around it. They were like, this is amazing, this is great. And I've had so many comments like that where people have just been amazed by the idea of, oh, this person has absolutely no sight and they're playing a video game. But then there are people who've also said, I can't play, I could never do this. I could never actually close my eyes and play a video game without the video. And then I say, right, come over here and try playing Killer Instinct without looking at it. And sometimes they do even better than they would do normally. And I'm like, well, I've just proven your point. You can play a video game without the video. It's possible. It's just a matter of giving it a go, taking that leap of faith, to use an Assassin's Creed reference, and deliberately, or even an audio game reference. Actually, there is an audio-only game called Leap of Faith where you're going through a sort of maze that's got it's a literal platformer, but that's a topic for another panel, possibly the interesting audio games that innovated on unusual experiences. But there are definitely times where sighted players they've underestimated their own abilities to play video games, without relying on the visuals. People have said they're called video games for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there video in video games if they're not meant to be seen, kind of thing? But it's important to remember that video games weren't always these visual powerhouses. They started as very blocky graphics on a computer with things like Space War and Pong and all of those kinds of games, but then they've gradually just become reliant on the visuals to appeal and give spectacle. So I'm going to hand back over to the panelists and let them continue that train of thought, should they so wish, and then we'll come to our final topic after that.
So I do want to touch on something that Mike said, and that's it. Audio games bring experiences that weren't really available at the time through video games. I mean, like Top Speed was a great one, like a racing game. Even Entombed, like a dungeon crawler. I can't think of many like accessible dungeon crawlers at the time Entombed came out. Same with a lot of side scrollers. So
Indeed.
I think a lot of people, especially a lot of blind people, try to make it feel like a console war. Like you can't like audio games if you like video games, or you can't like video games if you like audio games. But really, I find that audio games kind of supplement video games, because in a way they kind of foster what discussions and what accessibility features need to be added to video games, right? Because you have these indie blind audio game developers that make let's see, an RPG, and it's like, oh wow, that was a really good design. Like if something like that was in this mainstream RPG, it would be playable. And so that's why I think audio games really still have a lot to teach us. And if anything, like video games aside, they show that blind people can program and code, and that's another just huge accessibility benefit. So
yeah, I can see your logic.
I
Something
think
like it.
I think the thing we have to think about when it comes to audio games and versus video games versus it's just another genre. I mean, the video gaming
Yeah,
industry
yeah.
has hundreds of genres. We have RPGs, we have real-time strategies, we have combat, we have, you know, storytelling, all kinds of different genres. And audio games is just another genre. I tried to play real sound RTS with a low vision person, and she actually got into a state of panic because she could not keep the map in her mind. And that's just her learning pattern. That's just,
I completely understand. I tried that.
Yep.
Same situation for me.
yeah,
in
coming
parts.
from somebody's learning perspective and how somebody thinks and how somebody, you know, interacts with the world. I mean, going into my academic mode, we have visual learners, we have tactile learners, we have audio learners, and all these games fit those different environments. I think a good video game developer would think about all these different types of modalities and make sure that somebody could use one, both, all three, and get out of their game what they want, and they would have a huge audience.
And let's, from there, I think, Lucy, that's a great point to make. The fact that, you know, games can reach a massive audience, but let's, you know, regardless of the genre, they have the potential to reach a massive audience if there's enough accessibility there as well. But with that, let's move into the final topic, which kind of covers all of the things we've just discussed, which is the future of accessible gaming. So things like the community developer relationship, and you know, what we would like to see in the future. So I'll just start with mine and keep it brief as best I can. Essentially, I'd like to see developers reaching out to a greater, like as many consultants as they can, as early in development as they can, and budgeting in that as well, in terms of budgeting in the consultancy and making sure that there's ways for people to play test the games as they go through the various phases of development. But I'd also like there to be channels for community members, so players like ourselves, players like, well, anybody, to reach out and say, look, could you implement these things for, you know, these accessibility reasons, for instance, and developers can look at those things and attempt to add them as best as they can into their games. And once those elements become standard, much like, you know, Microsoft's menu narration seems to have become the standard for the majority of games of late, you know, those kinds of things can carry forward, which is, you know, where you want things to be. And as for what I hope to see in the future, I'll leave that until the rest of the panelists have spoken. But yeah, I'll hand back to you three to discuss what you think you'd like to see, and you know, where you'd like things to move forward in terms of accessible gaming, however you want to define that.
Yeah, so what you said really about communication is key. But I also think that communication is good, but it's only one part. So it's like a developer can be like, oh yeah, we're totally going to add these accessibility features. But like you said, Sightless Combat, if you don't plan from the beginning to add these accessibility features, to add a budget, it's like you're not really accomplishing much. So essentially, I feel like these developers need to, you know, let us know that they're adding accessibility features, keep communication open, be transparent, but also essentially, I can't think of a better way to say this, but like put your money where your mouth is, essentially. So like if you're going to say you're going to add something, like do it, instead of being like, oh yeah, maybe we'll do that in the next generation down the line.
Be forthright, be forthright,
exactly,
and forward with it, and essentially implement. I was just thinking of the "just do it" meme. You
okay,
know, that kind of thing, essentially.
Because see, the thing is, when a developer's like, "Oh wow, that's really insightful," like we'll look at that later down the line. To a blind person, to a disabled person, that just reads as you're not taking this seriously. At least that's how it comes across to me, and that's why communication is important. Like, communicate what your intentions are from the beginning. And if your intentions are to add more accessibility, I'm sure more people will be buying your game.
Well, even just now, like I've tried to get this game, Slay the Spire, and unfortunately with Steam, it's inaccessible. So, you know, given the screen reader I have. So it's make sure that that accessibility is thought through, right through all the different, including the marketing, including how you get the game, right? I would love a deck building roguelike. That just sounds wonderful. And I would be playing it nonstop probably, but I can't because Steam is inaccessible. Therefore, I can't get the component that someone else made to make this game accessible. They shouldn't even have to have done that. I feel like that's something that an original company should have done. But again, it's awareness. We have to, a lot of people aren't aware of the possibilities of,
exactly.
of going beyond audio. So it's partly, we have to help try educating them as well on what is possible. Like a game like A Hero's Call proves pretty conclusively that any of these turn-based role-playing games could probably be made accessible, given the design of that game. But the developers would have had to be exposed to that to even think that it might be as possible. So I would hope that more game developers would include us from day one in terms of accessibility, like 6age's Ride Like the Wind did. That's a perfect example of someone who went well out of their way to even describe, right down to describing the hand-drawn art in the game, and making sure that, really maximizing how VoiceOver was used. That's the screen reader on iOS, and its functions we use to the maximum to give us the information as easily as possible. Efforts like that do pay off, but you have to know that it's possible to do that before you contemplate that, adding in these features. So
sorry to cut you off, Michael, but so essentially what you're saying is platform accessibility as well. So all aspects should be as accessible as possible. So platform that the game's going to run on, the platforms that the game is going to run on, the marketing, the game itself, everything surrounding that. I just wanted to give time for Lucy to lend her perspective to this before we wrap up.
So I think this is actually all going to the big theme of every talk I've given in the past, many years that I've been working, is that the only way you're going to get accessibility is to include people with disabilities. All these barriers that you've mentioned that have happened in the development stage, and the fact that a game can't be gotten to, or, it's great if this feature does this, but all this stuff could have been avoided if you include people with disabilities in your development process. I mean, it's really hard to have the person sitting across the aisle in their cube in the game studio not be able to play your own product. People don't want that to happen. Everybody in the studio is going to have to try playing that game. And if you have people with disabilities on your development team, even if that person maybe is in the accounting, they still are going to be somebody you can turn to check. So include people with disabilities on your staff is a big theme I always push for accessibility, because it might be a big advocacy organization's tagline, but I like using it anyways. Nothing for us without us. You can't.
Nothing about us without us. Just to be clear. It's close enough.
I'm not part of that organization, so.
Neither am I, but still, I've seen it a few times in various accessibility posts. So, yeah.
To answer your actual question about what I want in the future is, I want to be able to go to a store and pick up a title and at least be able to find the accessibility features in that title, be able to try it, to play it. A lot of the mainstream organizations don't even give you money back if it's not accessible. And I don't think we need to ask for money back. I think we need to ask for the accessibility to be just another requirement in every development cycle.
I agree.
Yeah.
So, when games go, I was just going to say, when games go through certification processes, you mean, so, you get testers as part of the certification process, maybe. Is that what you're suggesting, Lucy?
Why not have them be in part of that certification process, but why not have them be development staff? There are,
of course, yeah.
There are plenty of people with disabilities who are, engineers, who can program, who can code. I even know a couple of blind graphic designers. There are people who are quadriplegics who are designing software on a daily basis. Have these people in your development team. Like I said, it's easy to say, oh, a blind person can't play my game. But when that blind person is John, who sits in the cube next to you, it's a lot harder to say that.
Yeah, it's like you say that to their face. Say you can't play my game. But no, like I just what you said, Lucy, earlier really resonated with me. Is that you just want to walk in and be able to pick up a game. That's all we're asking. Just
Yes, 100%.
just to be able to play a game. Like I can't. None of us can really stress enough like how much accessibility matters. Like so. For example, if you guys could see me, like I'm 6'2", 200 pounds athlete, right? But when I hear things about accessibility, like I almost start crying like a baby because that's how big this is. Like I'm trying to think, it's like just going back to the hunger, or like being starving. It's like giving a starving person like a full course meal. That's like each time an accessibility feature comes out, just a single accessibility feature comes out is like having a full course meal, at least for me, because that's how important this is. That's how much we've been asking for and just how much it means to us.
Just to be clear, Ross, I think if we want to just briefly elaborate on that, it's a full sort of meal when the accessibility features benefit you, whether that's like an aim assist, whether that's I don't know, a camera follow for so that you can pathfind easily, like in Last of Us 2, like in Gears of War 1, all the way back in 2006, 2007 ish.
Yep.
Actually 2006, yeah, all the way back in 2006 when Gears of War 1 released, they had a feature that allowed you to essentially move through all of the corridors and things as long as you had a co-op partner in front of you who was moving in the right direction. And even tiny things like that are accessibility features.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm going to ask is the final quick question is, what would one takeaway be from this panel? What do you want developers, the public, anyone to take away from this?
I'd say there's only so much that we can say in this panel. So really reach out to people in the disabled community, anyone, just get some feedback, because there's so much more that we can show in the way we play, in the videos that we make, than just this quick little panel, which I wish if we could, we could talk for hours and hours. Sorry.
We could indeed. Lucy, your brief, like, one sentence takeaway?
My one sentence takeaway is, I want to play. I am here, I want to play, and I am not unusual. There are other people like me. You need to reach out to them, and you need to make your games so that everyone can play. Not just me, not just you, but everyone can play.
Yes.
And Mike?
I would say, if you can include enough accessibility features to let me play the game fully and not feel I'm missing out, then I will be one very loyal customer. I will chase that experience, particularly if it's a popular one that a lot of people are playing as well. I will want that experience, and I will chase it, and I will stay with that because there are less options, for one thing. I don't have any other really escapes. So every time an accessible game comes out, it's pounced on by the blind community, and because it's usually the only one that comes out at a given time. I'd love to see that change, it could, I think.
Yeah, we're going to have to end it here, unfortunately, but I'll leave with my takeaway, and I will echo the sentiments of all our panelists here, and use the slogan from the Microsoft Super Bowl ad, the critically acclaimed Super Bowl ad, and say, when everybody plays, we all win. And I think that still holds true, regardless of how many times it's said in terms of accessibility. I'd like to thank all the panelists here. I'd like to thank Ross. I'd like to thank Lucy. And I'd like to thank Mike. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming along and watching, as well as the GAConf team for allowing us to put this panel together. So if you do have any questions, feel free to ask us. We will have likely been in the chat answering questions already, but we will be there for discussions as well. And you should be able to reach us via other means as well, should you need to. through the GAConf website too. So hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the conference. Stay safe and stay well. And we will likely all see you in a game at some point in the future.
Did that get recorded?
Are we good?
It did, but I'm trying to get it to turn off.
Speech mode top. Yes button.